On this channel, I've made a lot of videos defending the historical reliability of the Gospels, and one of the most common objections I hear is that my views aren't in line with modern scholarship. And I admit it, if you're a Christian and you're looking for evidence for your faith, you and I are guaranteed to lose the credential war. That doesn't mean that there aren't good conservative Christian scholars out there like D.A. Carson or Craig Blomberg, but they are a minority voice. The scholarly consensus is against me. I get it. Here's the thing though, this doesn't really bother me, and it shouldn't bother you. While it is true that when it comes to searching for the truth, none of us can be an expert on every single subject. So if the consensus of virologists say that vaccines save lives, then I don't think I need to get an advanced degree in biology to trust that what they're giving me is the facts. And if the consensus of historians say that Muhammad really was a historical person, I tend to believe them. But that doesn't mean that I should just blindly trust the expert consensus if that consensus gives us good reasons to doubt them. And when it comes to the field of New Testament studies, the experts have definitely raised a few eyebrows. Let's start with every atheist YouTuber's favorite go-to scholar, Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman has a PhD and is the professor at UNC Chapel Hill of Religious Studies. He's written and edited 30 books, including 3 college textbooks. He's also authored 6 New York Times bestsellers, which often popularize this scholarly consensus. So this means that we can trust what he says, right? Well, I mean, sometimes, but often Bart says things that any literate person can see is obviously wrong. Let's take a look at a few examples. In his book, Jesus Interrupted, Ehrman says that he's introducing his readers into a world of contradictions found in the New Testament. Well, if there's a world of contradictions rather than a small handful, then we can't take the Gospels to be reliable historical records. But when we examine just a few of Bart's examples closely, we find that they aren't even moderately credible. Here's just one example, reading Ehrman's own words. He says, in John's Gospel, Jesus performs his first miracle in chapter 2, when he turns water into wine, a favorite miracle story on college campuses. And we're told that this was the first sign that Jesus did, John 2:11. Later in that chapter, we're told that Jesus did many signs in Jerusalem, John 2:23. And then in chapter 4, he heals the son of a centurion, and the author says this was the second sign that Jesus did, John 4:54. Huh? One sign, many signs, and then the second sign? In other words, the author of John is so inattentive that he doesn't even notice that he's contradicting himself. But what happens when we look at these verses for ourselves? Let's look at John 2:11. It says, "This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him." Notice that Ehrman cuts out the inconvenient Cana of Galilee part. He does it again in John 4:54. The verse reads, "This was now the second sign that Jesus did when he had come from Judea to Galilee." The many signs mentioned in John 2:23 were, as Ehrman himself admits, worked in Jerusalem, which isn't Galilee. It's pretty obvious that John is applying the numbers to miracles performed in Galilee, and once we take that into consideration, the supposed contradiction goes away. I have to say this isn't a very good look. And this isn't an isolated incident. Let's look at another one. Ehrman suggests telltale signs of gospel development between Mark and Luke. When speaking of Jesus' death in Mark, Ehrman says, Jesus is silent the entire time as if in shock until the cry at the end echoing Psalm 22. Mark is trying to say something by this portrayal. He doesn't want his readers to take solace in the fact that God was really there providing Jesus physical comfort. He dies in agony, unsure of the reason he must die. Now, regarding the parallel account in Luke, Ehrman also writes, in this account, Jesus is not at all confused about what is happening to him or why. He's completely calm and in control of the situation. He knows what is about to occur and he knows what will happen afterward. This is a far cry from the Jesus of Mark who felt forsaken to the end. But I have to say, this interpretation won't survive a simple reading of Mark's Gospel. Jesus isn't at all confused why he has to die. He talks about his death all the time in Mark's Gospel. Let's just take a look. Mark 8:31. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and after 3 days rise again. Or Mark 9:31. For he was teaching his disciples saying the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men and they will kill him. And when he is killed after 3 days he will rise. Or Mark 10:32 through 34. Taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, See, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and to the scribes. They will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him, flog him, and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise. Or how about Mark 10:45? For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. As for the charge of legendary development in Mark, as in all the synoptics, Jesus boldly answers the high priest's question, "Are you the Messiah?" And Jesus says, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." Yet this claim is absent in John's Gospel, the very last and most developed Gospel. Also, only in John, the last Gospel to be written, it records the most humid admission of physical pain and weakness in the words from the cross when he says, "I thirst." The idea of legendary development is pretty iffy. Now, Jesus' cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" like Barth says, is an allusion to Psalm 22, which was now publicly fulfilled. What Barth doesn't say is that in early Judaism, it was common to invoke a complete psalm just by quoting the opening line. And if you've read Psalm 22, you know that the psalmist does feel forsaken by God, but he does put his trust in Yahweh. He apparently dies or is dying, but is rescued. He says that all of the offspring of Jacob will stand in awe at the deliverance that happened, and all of the ends of the earth, the Gentiles, will remember this deliverance and turn to the Lord. This begins to happen when the centurion at the cross calls him the Son of God. And we also know from Psalm 22 that future generations are told of this deliverance. This is the psalm that Jesus applies to himself on the cross, and if we look around, we can see that it's definitely been fulfilled. I guess I fail to see a contradiction here, but Ehrman's charges against the Gospels go beyond just pointing out contradictions. Elsewhere in Jesus Interrupted, he points out a supposed historical error. He writes, "Their ignorance of Palestinian geography and Jewish customs suggests they composed their works somewhere else in the empire." Mark 7:3 indicates that the Pharisees and all the Jews washed their hands before eating so as to observe the tradition of the elders. This is not true. Most Jews did not engage in this ritual. Now, specifically, Ehrman is referring to Exodus 30:18 through 21, 40:30 through 32, and Leviticus 21 through 16, where only the priest and not the rest of Israel are called upon to follow hand-washing practices. Yet, did the Jews of Jesus' time, influenced by the Pharisees' practices, engage in this ritual despite the fact that it wasn't in the written law? Well, the Jewish evidence says yes. There's an Alexandrian Jew named Aristeas who lived in the 2nd or 3rd century BC who wrote in a letter, "As is all the custom of the Jews, they wash their hands in the sea and pray to God." Now, when somebody brought this up in Barth's comment section on his blog, he admitted his mistake, and I'll give him some props there for sure. But the majority of people who read Jesus Interrupted won't see Barth's mea culpa blog post. Hopefully it'll be corrected in future editions. Now, listen, we all make mistakes. I've definitely made my fair share of them, and I'm sure I'll probably make more. But here's the point. You have a lot of people putting their stock in Ehrman, including those famous aforementioned YouTubers. And remember, Ehrman is often popularizing the scholarly consensus. So when the Gospels aren't read with the same basic charity that we'd extend to other historical documents, it seems like we have some reasons to scratch beneath the surface and see exactly what's going on here. We can't have blind faith in credentials and parrot Barth's books just because we like what they say. Just in case you think I'm picking on one scholar, let's consider the case of Dr. Dale Martin, who is a professor of religious studies at Yale University. His course on New Testament history can be viewed for free right here on YouTube. The intro of the series has nearly 500,000 views at the moment. Now, I could gripe about a lot of the things he has to say in this lecture, but I'll just pick on two. Dr. Martin claims that Paul wasn't considered to be an apostle by the author of Acts. Acts 14:14 refers to the apostles Barnabas and Paul. I have to say, this is pretty indefensible. Martin also goes on to say that the book of Hebrews was not written to a Jewish audience, but a Gentile one. I mean, just how? The book is steeped in Jewish background, more than any other epistle, and it repeatedly warns Jewish believers not to return to Judaism in order to avoid persecution. The opening verse of the book of Hebrews says, "Long ago, at many times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets." This is just a bizarre reading. Martin and Ehrman are often presented as some of the best that modern scholarship has to offer, and yet these are just basic fundamental goofs that raise all kinds of questions. I think the philosopher Tim McGrew hits the nail on the head when he says, "An advanced degree is indirect evidence that you know what you're talking about. It's useful as far as it goes, but indirect evidence must give way in the presence of direct evidence. Show me that you know what you're talking about, and I don't care whether you have a degree. Show me that you don't know what you're talking about, And I don't care whether you have a degree. From what we've seen, we have some reasons to be skeptical of modern biblical critics. This isn't to say that everything that they say is wrong. Obviously, that's not true. Nor would I say that biblical critics don't raise any real difficulties against the New Testament that deserve to be answered. They certainly do. But here's the point. We can't place blind faith in scholars when we see stuff like this. When it comes to modern biblical criticism, appeals to scholarly consensus simply aren't strong by themselves. We need to look at the arguments by themselves regardless of the letters behind one's name who is making them.